Hello, and welcome to the Hour of War, where we journey back through time to witness the moments that forged our world in the crucible of conflict. Today, we begin an epic saga, the Crusades, the holy wars fought between the Cross and the Crescent. Our story starts not on a battlefield, but in the heart of medieval Europe. A world teetering on the edge of monumental change. The year is 1095. Picture a continent fragmented, yet united by a singular, powerful force: faith. In the West, Christendom was a tapestry of feudal lords, pious peasants, and a church whose power was reaching its zenith. To the East, the Islamic world, a vibrant civilization of science, art, and formidable military might, stretched from Spain to the frontiers of India. For centuries, these two worlds had collided and coexisted, their relationship a complex dance of trade, intellectual exchange, and simmering hostility. Pilgrims from Europe had long traveled to the Holy Land, to Jerusalem, a city sacred to Jews, Christians, and Muslims alike. But the political landscape was shifting. The Byzantine Empire, the Christian bastion of the East, was under immense pressure from the advancing Seljuk Turks, a powerful dynasty that had recently conquered much of Anatolia and taken control of Jerusalem. The once stable pilgrimage routes were becoming hazardous, and tales of Christian suffering, whether real or exaggerated, began filtering back to the West. The Byzantine Emperor, Alexios I Komnenos, sent a desperate plea to the West not for a holy war, but for mercenary knights to help him reclaim his lost territories. This plea would land on the desk of one of the most influential men in Christendom, Pope Urban II. Urban was a shrewd political operator and a devout reformer. He saw in Alexius's request a golden opportunity, an opportunity not just to aid a fellow Christian ruler, but to channel the restless, violent energies of Europe's knightly class outwards. For decades, the continent had been plagued by the private wars of feudal lords. Knights, trained for nothing but combat, preyed on the land and each other. Urban envisioned a grander purpose for their swords. He could unite the fractious Christian lords under a single banner, his banner, and assert the supremacy of the papacy over kings and emperors. He could heal the Great Schism of 1054, the rift that had split the Western and Eastern churches, by riding to the rescue of Constantinople. And most powerfully, he could answer the call to reclaim the most sacred city on earth, Jerusalem. The stage was set for an announcement that would change the course of history. In November of 1095, in a field outside the town of Clermont, France, Pope Urban II addressed a massive council of bishops, abbots, nobles, and common folk. The crowd was so large it spilled out from the cathedral into the open air. What he said that day became one of the most effective and consequential speeches ever delivered. We don't have a perfect transcript. Counts were written later, each with its own emphasis. But the core message was clear and electrifying. Urban painted a grim picture of the situation in the East. He spoke of Christian brethren suffering under the yoke of the infidel, of sacred churches being defiled, and of the Holy Sepulchre, the tomb of Christ himself, being in the hands of non-believers. He called upon the knights, the race of the Franks, to cease their petty, sinful wars against each other, and turn their righteous fury upon the enemies of God. He framed it not as a war of conquest, but as an act of liberation, a pilgrimage armed and armored. And then he made a promise that sealed the deal. For those who took up the cross and journeyed to the East, there would be a complete remission of sins. It was a spiritual masterstroke. For a medieval man, terrified of damnation and burdened by a life of violence and sin, this was an unprecedented offer, direct ticket to heaven. It was an escape from poverty, a chance for glory, and a path to salvation, all rolled into one. As he finished his thunderous oration, a chant rose from the crowd, a spontaneous, unified cry that became the motto of the entire movement. Deus vult. God wills it. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Deus vult echoed across the field as bishops and nobles knelt before the Pope, pledging to take the cross. The news spread like wildfire. Preachers like the charismatic Peter the Hermit fanned out across Europe, carrying Urban's message to every town and village. They spoke to peasants toiling in the fields, to artisans in their workshops, to lords in their castles. Their sermons, filled with passion and promises of divine reward, ignited a mass hysteria. This wasn't just a military expedition anymore. It was a mass movement, a folk migration. Thousands upon thousands of ordinary people, men, women, and even children, abandoned everything. They sewed crosses onto their clothes, sold their lands and possessions for a pittance, and joined the growing streams of humanity heading east. Blacksmiths, who once forged plows, now hammered out swords and spearheads. The roads of France and Germany became choked with a fervent, disorganized, and often unruly tide of pilgrims, convinced they were on a divine mission. This initial chaotic wave would become known as the People's Crusade, a tragic prelude to the main event. Meanwhile, the great lords of Europe began to organize their own armies. These were the professional soldiers Urban had initially targeted. Men like Godfrey of Bouillon, Duke of Lower Lorraine, the ambitious Bohemond of Taranto, a Norman prince from southern Italy, the wealthy and powerful Raymond of Toulouse, and the brother of the French king, Hugh of Vermandois. Their motives were a complex mix of genuine piety, lust for land and riches, and a desire for adventure and renown. Unlike the peasant mobs, their preparations were methodical. They gathered knights, infantry, supplies, and siege equipment. They planned their routes, negotiated passage, and prepared for a long and brutal campaign. These were the leaders of the Prince's Crusade, the military force that would ultimately define the First Crusade. While Peter the Hermit's followers marched into disaster, these powerful nobles were assembling the true iron fist of Christendom. As this storm gathered in the West, how did the Muslim world react? The East was far from a unified bloc. The Seljuk Empire itself was fractured by internal rivalries following the death of its great sultan, Malik Shah. In Egypt, the Fatimid Caliphate, who were Shia Muslims, were bitter rivals of the Sunni Seljuks and had their own designs on the Holy Land. In fact, just before the Crusaders arrived, the Fatimids had recaptured Jerusalem from the Seljuks. Too many local rulers in Syria and Palestine, the arrival of a new enemy from the West was just another complication in an already complex political game. They had seen Byzantine armies before. They had fought mercenaries. Initially, they underestimated the scale and, more importantly, the fanatical motivation of this new threat. They saw a disorganized rabble, not a holy war. They watched the gathering storm with a mix of curiosity and concern. But few could have predicted the sheer ferocity of the wave that was about to break upon their shores. Jerusalem, the sacred city, the jewel coveted by all, lay at the heart of the coming tempest, its fate hanging in the balance. Two worlds, driven by faith and bound by destiny, were now on a collision course. The First Crusade had begun. The call from the cross had been answered. An army of faith, vengeance, and ambition was on the march, heading for the heart of the Islamic world. What happened when these two forces finally met? The journey was just as perilous as the destination, a brutal march across a continent that would test the Crusaders to their absolute limits. If you're captivated by this epic story, make sure you're subscribed to the Hour of War and have notifications turned on. In our next episode, we'll follow the Crusaders on their grueling trek to Constantinople and beyond, into the heart of enemy territory. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time. From the frozen fields of France to the sun-baked roads of Byzantium, they came, knights, peasants, beggars, and lords all, bound by a single, powerful cry: God wills it. This wasn't just a slogan. It was a spark that had ignited a continent. The First Crusade had truly begun, and all of Europe was on the move. Imagine vast columns of men, women, and even children, trekking thousands of miles eastward, their clothes and banners marked with the simple, stark image of a red cross. This was the symbol of their vow, a promise made to God himself. But make no mistake, this was no peaceful pilgrimage. This was a storm of faith and fury, a human avalanche rolling towards the Holy Land. At the head of this incredible procession rode men of immense power and ambition. Figures like the wealthy and pious Raymond of Toulouse, one of the most powerful lords in all of Europe, marching alongside the cunning Norman warrior, Bohemond of Toronto. Their armor gleamed under the sun, but their ambition shone even brighter, sharper than their swords. They were the generals, the leaders, the hardened core of this holy war. But behind them followed tens upon tens of thousands, a sprawling, chaotic mass of humanity. Many were starving, most were untrained in the art of war, yet they were all united by an unshakable certainty that heaven itself was guiding their march. They believed they were God's chosen instrument, and this belief gave them a strength that defied logic. As this monumental force crossed into the Byzantine Empire, the emperor in Constantinople, Alexios I Komnenos, looked upon this approaching horde not with relief, but with a growing sense of dread. Pope Urban had promised him an army of elite Frankish knights to help push back the Turks. What he got was something else entirely. This wasn't a disciplined army. It was chaos cloaked in faith. To Alexios, these Crusaders were a double-edged sword. On one hand, they were potential saviors who could help him reclaim lost territories. On the other, they were a massive, unpredictable threat to his own capital and his empire's stability. He played a delicate game, a masterclass in diplomacy and manipulation. He fed them, he supplied them, and he prayed they would move on as quickly as possible past his lands and into the heart of enemy territory. He knew that faith, much like fire, is a powerful tool, but is never easily contained or controlled. And Alexios's fears were not unfounded. The journey was brutal and lawless. As the Crusaders marched, their discipline frayed. Villages along their path were pillaged, their supplies vanishing into the hungry mouths of the massive column. The locals, fellow Christians, often looked upon these saviors with terror. And in the midst of this chaos, an even more fanatical element emerged. Preachers like Peter the Hermit had whipped up a frenzy among the common folk, creating what became known as the People's Crusade. This was not an army, but a mob, driven by pure, unrefined zealotry. Their march through Europe became a trail of destruction. They slaughtered anyone they deemed an enemy of Christ, tragically including thousands of Jewish people in the towns of the Rhineland. In one of the most shameful episodes of the entire crusade, it was a grim foreshadowing of the violence to come. This wave of poorly armed peasants would be one of the first to reach Anatolia, where they were swiftly and brutally annihilated by the Seljuk Turks. It was a harsh lesson. Faith alone was not enough to win a war. Yet, from this sea of madness and tragedy, the main force of true warriors, the princes and their knights, finally began to emerge. They were the ones Pope Urban had originally envisioned. Better equipped, better led, and far more disciplined than the People's Crusade, they were the real military threat. After complex negotiations and a series of tense standoffs with Emperor Alexios, they finally agreed to cross the Bosporus Strait. Leaving the familiar world of Christendom behind and stepping onto the shores of Asia Minor, they were now in lands where the Crescent, the symbol of Islam, had ruled for decades. The rolling hills and vast open plains of Anatolia stretched before them. This was the domain of the Seljuk Turks' master horsemen, swift as the desert wind, born from the steppes of Central Asia, and the fierce defenders of Islam. The Crusaders' first major objective was the great city of Nicaea, the Seljuk capital in the region. The siege was long and difficult, testing the Crusaders' engineering skills and their patience. They had to fight off not only the city's garrison, but also a relief army led by the Seljuk Sultan himself, Kilij Arslan. It was here that the Crusaders, fighting alongside their wary Byzantine allies, secured their first major victory. The fall of Nicaea was a huge morale boost and a strategic triumph. But Kilij Arslan was not defeated. He was enraged. He gathered his forces, vowing to ambush and destroy this invading army in the open field. He planned his attack near a place called Dorylaeum. This would be the first true test of this so-called army of God against the full might of the Turkish cavalry. It was a clash of civilizations, a battle that would baptize Europe's holy war in fire and blood. The fate of the entire crusade hung in the balance under the vast Anatolian sky. The Battle of Dorylaeum was a near disaster. The Crusaders, marching in two separate columns, were caught off guard. Bohemund's smaller contingent was surrounded by Kilij Arslan's fast-moving horse archers. The Turks unleashed a storm of arrows, pinning down the knights. For hours, under the scorching sun, the outnumbered Normans formed a defensive circle, enduring relentless attacks. They were on the brink of annihilation. But just when all seemed lost, the second, larger Crusader column, led by Godfrey and Raymond, arrived. Their appearance on the battlefield completely turned the tide. What had been a desperate defense transformed into a crushing counterattack. The combined Crusader force charged, their heavy cavalry smashing through the surprised Turkish lines. The Seljuks, who had thought victory was theirs, were utterly routed. Dorylaeum was a stunning and decisive victory for the Crusaders. It proved that their heavy armored knights could, in fact, defeat the feared Turkish horse archers in a pitched battle. It opened the road across Anatolia, but the journey was far from over. The march that followed was even more grueling than the battle itself, a torturous trek across a dry, desolate landscape where more people died from thirst, starvation, and disease than from any enemy sword. Yet they pushed on, their faith, though tested, unbroken. Their eyes were fixed on one prize, one holy city that justified all their suffering, Jerusalem. Welcome back to the Hour of War. When we last left the First Crusade, the Knights of Christendom had triumphed at Nicaea and Dorylaeum, but their journey was far from over. Before them lay a challenge greater than any they had faced, the mighty ancient city of Antioch. To reach Jerusalem, they had to conquer it. Antioch wasn't just a fortress, it was a legend. Its walls, stretching for miles, were said to be unbreakable, studded with over 400 towers. For centuries, it had stood as a jewel of the East, a crossroads of empires and faiths. The Romans had built its aqueducts, the Byzantines its churches, and now, the Seljuk Turks, under the command of Yogisian, held it fast. This was the prize the Crusaders had to claim. In October of 1097, the vast Crusader army arrived at the Orontes River, gazing up at the city's imposing ramparts. Their leaders Bohemund of Taranto, Raymond of Toulouse, Godfrey of Bouillon knew a direct assault was suicide. A siege was the only option. They set up camp, surrounding the city, hoping to starve the defenders out. They had no idea they were about to be trapped in a nightmare of their own making. The first few weeks were filled with misplaced optimism. The Crusaders controlled the surrounding countryside and foraged for food. But as autumn turned to winter, the situation grew desperate. The lush Syrian plains transformed into a desolate sea of mud. Torrential rains flooded their camp, turning it into a cesspool of filth and disease. Supplies dwindled, then vanished completely. The once proud knights were reduced to beggars. Horses, their symbols of status and instruments of war, died by the thousands. Men chewed on leather straps and boiled roots to survive. Famine stalked the camp, a silent predator more deadly than any Seljuk arrow. Chronicles from the time speak of men so starved they would dig up buried bodies for anything to eat. The army was disintegrating. Men deserted, trying to make their way back to Constantinople, while others simply lay down in the mud and waited for death. Inside Antioch, Yagi Sujan watched the Christian army rot. He had prepared for a long siege, stockpiling food and water. His garrison was well fed and confident. From the top of the walls, his soldiers would taunt the starving Crusaders, lowering baskets of bread just out of reach, laughing at their misery. The psychological toll was immense. The Crusaders began to wonder if God had abandoned them. Was this holy war a terrible mistake? Just as all hope seemed lost, a glimmer appeared. The cunning and ambitious Bohemond of Taranto, who coveted Antioch for himself, had been secretly negotiating. He found a weak link inside the city, an Armenian tower commander named Firuz. Disgruntled with his Turkish masters, Firuz agreed to betray the city. The price: gold and a promise of power. The plan was set for the night of June 2nd, 1098, under the cover of a raging storm. A small elite group of Bohemond's knights crept towards the Tower of the Two Sisters, which Firuz commanded. A leather ladder was lowered from the ramparts. One by one, the knights climbed into the darkness, their hearts pounding. Once inside, they overpowered the nearby guards and raced to open a postern gate. The gate creaked open. The signal was given. The Crusader army, which had been waiting in silence, surged forward. What followed was not a battle, but a slaughter. After 8 months of starvation, humiliation, and suffering, the Crusaders' pent-up fury was unleashed. They poured into the sleeping city like a dam breaking. The streets of Antioch became a river of blood. In the pre-dawn chaos, no one was spared. Men, women, children's Turkish, and even local Christian were cut down indiscriminately. The air filled with screams, the clash of steel, and the roar of fires as the Crusaders looted and burned everything in sight. By morning, the city was theirs. The Crescent banner had been torn down, and the cross flew over the citadel. It was a stunning, brutal victory. But their triumph was dangerously brief. As the Crusaders were still celebrating amidst the carnage, a terrifying sight appeared on the horizon. A massive relief army, led by the powerful Atabeg of Mosul Kerboga, had arrived. The Crusaders had taken Antioch, but now they were trapped inside it. The conquerors had become the besieged. Kerboga's forces surrounded the city, cutting off all escape. The situation inside Antioch was even worse than it had been outside. The Crusaders had found little food in the city they had just plundered, and now they were locked in with a starving population. The tables had turned completely. Despair reached its lowest point. Knights who had survived months in the mud now hid in cellars, weeping and convinced their end was near. It was in this moment of absolute hopelessness that faith, or perhaps hysteria, intervened. A poor peasant from Provence, Peter Bartholomew, came forward with an incredible claim. He said that St. Andrew had appeared to him in a series of visions, revealing the location of the Holy Lance, the very spear that had pierced the side of Christ on the cross. At first, the leaders were skeptical, but desperation makes people believe. They followed Peter to the Cathedral of St. Peter, and after a day of frantic digging, a piece of metal was unearthed from the floor. Was it the true Holy Lance? It didn't matter. For the starving, demoralized army, it was a sign from God. Their faith, which had flickered and nearly died, roared back to life like a wildfire. Energized by this divine relic, the Crusaders were transformed. They were no longer a broken army. They were God's chosen warriors, invincible and righteous. On June 28, 1098, against all military logic, they threw open the gates of Antioch and marched out to face Kerboga's vastly superior army. They marched not as soldiers, but as zealots. Priests held aloft the Holy Lance, chanting psalms as the knights charged forward. Kerboga, confident in his numbers, was taken completely by surprise by their ferocity. His coalition of emirs, plagued by internal rivalries, fractured at the critical moment. The Crusader charge, fueled by a potent mix of starvation and divine madness, smashed through his lines. The great Muslim army panicked and fled. Against all odds, the Crusaders had won. They had conquered Antioch not once, but twice first, through betrayal and brutality, and then through a miracle born of desperation. The road to Jerusalem was now open. But the siege of Antioch had changed them. It had forged them in a crucible of suffering and fanaticism, setting the stage for the even bloodier climax of the First Crusade. The cost of this victory was immense, and the journey's end was still far. What will happen when this army, convinced of its divine destiny, finally reaches the gates of the Holy City itself? Join us next time on the Hour of War to find out. Thanks for watching, and be sure to like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss the epic conclusion. The gates of Antioch were behind them, blackened, bloodied, and now eerily silent. A hard-won victory, but one that felt more like a curse. Ahead lay the vast, unforgiving Syrian desert. And somewhere beyond that shimmering horizon was their ultimate goal: Jerusalem. The First Crusade was no longer the glorious procession of knights and pilgrims that had left Europe. What marched south now was a ghost army, a haunting procession of broken men. They were haunted by the victory they had just achieved, by the faces of comrades they'd left behind, and by the gnawing emptiness in their own stomachs. Their once gleaming armor hung loose on skeletal frames, thinned by relentless hunger and disease. Horses, the symbols of knightly power, would simply collapse mid-step, their strength finally spent. The proud banners, once emblazoned with the cross and shining with holy purpose, were now just tattered rags fluttering against a merciless sun. But still, they marched. They pushed forward, one agonizing step at a time. They moved through the ruins of ancient cities, testaments to empires long gone. They crossed fields that had been burned to dust, either by their own foraging parties or by the retreating enemy. They trudged through lands whose people whispered curses as they passed. A pervasive scent clung to them, the stench of death. It wasn't just the memory of those they had slain in battle. It was the ever-present odor of their own fallen comrades, left in shallow graves along the route. Every day was a struggle for survival. The leadership was fractured. After the capture of Antioch, Bohemond of Taranto decided to stay and claim the city for himself, creating his own principality. This betrayal angered Raymond of Toulouse, who had also coveted the city. The internal squabbling threatened to tear the crusade apart from within. The common soldiers and pilgrims, tired of the nobles' endless bickering and lust for power, grew restless. Their faith was in Jerusalem, not in the petty ambitions of their commanders. It was the pressure from the rank and file, their unwavering focus on the Holy City, that forced the remaining leaders to finally continue the march. By late 1098, their path led them to the gates of Merit al-Nu'man. Another fortified city stood in their way. What followed was a brutal siege that pushed the Crusaders to the absolute brink of human endurance. As the weeks dragged into months, their meager supplies vanished completely. The winter rains turned the landscape into a muddy quagmire, making foraging impossible. Starvation, a familiar enemy, returned with a vengeance. It was here, in the cold, desperate siege of Merat, that the Crusaders' journey descended into its darkest chapter. Hunger twisted their minds, driving them to acts of unspeakable madness. The chronicles of the time, written by men who were there, whisper of the ultimate taboo: cannibalism. They speak of desperate soldiers driven by a gnawing agony that overrode all morality, boiling the flesh of the dead to survive. Whether this was a widespread practice or the isolated acts of a few men driven insane by suffering, we may never know for sure. But the accounts exist, a horrifying testament to how close they came to utter collapse. Their faith had twisted into a fever, a desperate, consuming fire that devoured everything, even their own humanity. And yet, somehow, the march continued. After Merit fell, the army staggered onward. By the time the spring of 1099 arrived, their numbers had been decimated. Of the massive host that had left Constantinople, fewer than half remained. But those who were left were no longer just soldiers or pilgrims. They had been forged into something else entirely in the crucible of Antioch and Merit. They were zealots, tempered in fire and starvation. They were men who had stared into the abyss and had not flinched. They had come to believe that death itself had no real power over them or their divine mission. Then, one day in early June, they crested a hill, and there it was. Sprawling across the landscape, its walls and towers shimmering in the morning light Jerusalem. For men who had marched for 3 years through a living hell, the sight was overwhelming. Mighty knights, men who had charged into Saracen lines without a flicker of fear, fell to their knees and wept openly. They kissed the sacred ground. After years of bloodshed, starvation, and despair, they had finally reached the city of God. The end of their pilgrimage was in sight, but the city was not theirs yet. High on the battlements, the defenders watched their arrival. The city was now controlled by the Fatimid Caliphate of Egypt, who had recently captured it from the Seljuks. They were well supplied, well garrisoned, and they knew the Franks were coming. They had poisoned the wells outside the city and prepared for a long siege. They saw the Crusaders not as holy pilgrims, but as a swarm of destructive locusts, and they were ready to meet them with steel, stone, and fire. The Crusaders made their camp outside the formidable walls. The final, desperate phase had begun. There was a grim sense of purpose in the air. Priests walked barefoot through the ranks, chanting psalms and offering blessings. Carpenters began the monumental task of building siege towers, using scarce timber hauled from miles away. Every nail hammered into the wood seemed to carry the weight of prophecy and the hopes of all Christendom. Knights sat by campfires, sharpening their blades by moonlight, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames. They whispered final confessions to the priests, sins they would not live to repeat. The desert wind howled around the city walls, carrying with it a single sacred name: Jerusalem. A city holy to Jews, Christians, and Muslims alike. A city that had seen centuries of peace and prayer. Now it was about to drown in a torrent of blood. The final reckoning was at hand. Thank you for joining us for this part of our journey. The assault on Jerusalem is next. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the Hour of War, because the final battle for the Holy City is about to begin. The horns shattered the dawn. It was July 15th, 1099. For 3 years, they had marched, starved, and fought their way across a continent, all for this single moment. Before them, bathed in the hazy morning light, stood Jerusalem. For the thousands of Crusaders kneeling in the dirt, it wasn't just a city of stone and mortar. It was the center of the world, the prize of God Himself. Their armor was battered, their bodies were scarred, and their minds were frayed by the horrors they had witnessed and inflicted. But in their eyes, there was a terrifying, unshakable conviction. The silence was broken by the groaning of timber. Massive siege towers, patched together with desperation and ingenuity, began to inch forward. They were clumsy, monstrous things, but they represented the culmination of years of bloody effort. From the walls, the city's defenders, a mix of Fatimid Egyptians and local militia, answered with a storm of their own. Arrows hissed through the air like angry hornets, and pots of Greek fire exploded, turning men into living torches. The noise was deafening: the splintering of wood, the clang of steel, the screams of the dying, and the endless, roaring prayers of the attackers. Hour after agonizing hour, the battle raged. Ladders were thrown against the walls only to be pushed back, sending men tumbling to their deaths. Battering rams pounded uselessly against ancient stone. The sun climbed higher, beating down on the carnage, turning the dust and blood into a thick red mud. It seemed impossible. The city, which had withstood sieges for centuries, was holding firm. Doubt began to creep into the hearts of the Crusaders. Had they come all this way, suffered so much, only to fail at the very gates of salvation? Then, around noon, a breakthrough. On the northern wall, the siege tower commanded by Godfrey of Bouillon finally gained a foothold. The drawbridge slammed down, and for a heart-stopping moment there was a clear path onto the battlements. A knight named Leuthold of Tournai was supposedly the first to leap across, followed immediately by Godfrey himself. The sight of the Crusader banner, the cross, finally flying over the walls sent a shockwave of adrenaline through the attacking army. A primal roar erupted from thousands of throats. This was it. The defenders fought with the desperation of people protecting their homes, but the tide had turned. Once the walls were breached, the gates couldn't hold for long. The main gates were thrown open from the inside, and the Crusader army surged into the city like a flood. But the battle wasn't over. It transformed into something far more brutal. Every street, every alleyway became a slaughterhouse. The fight for the city became a chaotic, house-to-house struggle. What happened over the next 2 days has stained the pages of history forever. The disciplined assault devolved into a frenzied massacre. The Crusaders, convinced that the city's inhabitants were enemies of God, showed no mercy. They had been promised that their sins would be washed away, and in their minds, this holy war justified any atrocity. Men, women, children, it didn't matter. They were cut down in the streets, in their homes, and in their places of worship. Chroniclers from the time, both Christian and Muslim, paint a horrifying picture. Raymond of Aguilars, a Crusader priest who was there, wrote that the carnage was so great that men waded in blood up to their ankles and knees. The city's Jewish population, who had fought alongside the Muslim defenders, retreated to their main synagogue. The Crusaders barred the doors and set it on fire, burning everyone inside alive. Thousands of Muslims sought sanctuary within the sacred precinct of the Temple Mount. In the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock, they believed the sanctity of the place would protect them. They were wrong. Tancred of Hauteville, one of the Crusader leaders, had initially promised protection to those in the Al-Aqsa Mosque, giving them his banner as a sign of safety. But he couldn't control the mob. His fellow Crusaders stormed the holy site, and what followed was one of the worst massacres of the entire campaign. The floor of the mosque was said to be so slick with blood that it was difficult to stand. It was a scene of apocalyptic violence, a frenzy of vengeance and religious fervor that spared no one. And then, amidst the killing, came the most surreal moment of all. After wading through streets slick with gore, their swords and armor dripping with the blood of thousands, the victors made their way to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the site believed to hold the tomb of Christ. They dropped their weapons, stripped off their boots, and fell to their knees. Covered in the filth of battle, these men, who had just committed unspeakable acts, began to weep. They cried tears of joy, of relief, of overwhelming piety. They had done it. They had reclaimed the holiest site in Christendom. In their minds, the horror they had unleashed was a righteous act, a brutal but necessary cleansing of the holy city. As the sun set on a city of ghosts, the reality of their victory began to sink in. Jerusalem was theirs. The goal of the First Crusade, the dream that had been preached in Clermont 3 years earlier, had been achieved. But the cost was immense, not just in lives, but in something less tangible. The city they had fought to liberate was now a tomb. The holy sites were desecrated not by the defenders, but by the liberators themselves. Standing on the walls, looking out over the conquered territory, the Crusader leaders understood that this was not the end. It was a new beginning. They had carved out a kingdom from hostile land, but they were an island in a vast, resentful sea. Their victory had been so shocking, so total, that it sent a tremor throughout the entire Muslim world. In cities like Damascus, Aleppo, and Cairo, the news of Jerusalem's fall was met with disbelief, then grief, and then a burning desire for revenge. The Crusaders had won the battle for Jerusalem, but in doing so, they had ignited a fire that would burn for centuries. They had not just conquered a city. They had awakened a sleeping giant. The age of jihad had been given a new, powerful focus: the reclamation of Al-Quds, the holy city. Thank you for watching this chapter of our series on the Crusades. The fall of Jerusalem was a pivotal moment, but the story is far from over. The response from the Muslim world will be swift and powerful, setting the stage for the next 100 years of conflict. If you want to see what happens next, make sure you're subscribed to the channel and hit that notification bell. We appreciate your support. See you next time. For nearly 100 years, the Crusader states had clung to the Levanten coast, a stubborn Christian kingdom carved into the heart of the Muslim world. Jerusalem, the holy city, was under the rule of the cross. But in the fractured landscape of the Middle East, a new power was beginning to coalesce. A new leader was about to emerge from the chaos. His name would become legend, a name whispered with respect by his enemies and revered by his allies. This is the story of the rise of Al-Bayadien Yusuf ibn Abi, known to the West as Saladin. Hello and welcome back to the Hour of War. In our last episode, we saw the Second Crusade falter and the Crusader states solidify their position, but the Muslim world remained dangerously divided. Today, we witness the rise of the man who would finally unite them. Saladin was not born into a royal lineage. He was a Kurd, born in Tikrit in modern-day Iraq, into a family of soldiers and administrators. His youth was not spent dreaming of conquest, but in study. He was a quiet, thoughtful young man, more interested in theology and law than in the art of war. He was raised in the court of Damascus, surrounded by scholars, where he learned that true strength came not just from the sword, but from justice, piety, and an unshakable resolve. He was taught that mercy was as much a part of faith as victory. The world Saladin grew up in was a whirlwind of conflict. The Seljuk Empire had fractured. In its place, a mosaic of competing emirates and principalities vied for power. The Zengid dynasty, under the powerful ruler Nur ad-Din, was attempting to stitch these pieces back together, fighting a war on two fronts, against fellow Muslims and against the encroaching Frankish Crusaders. The spiritual heart of Islam, Jerusalem, remained in Crusader hands, a constant, painful reminder of their disunity. The Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt was a shadow of its former self, weakened by internal strife and court intrigue. The call for jihad, for a unified struggle to reclaim what was lost, was a potent idea, but it lacked a leader who could truly embody it. It was under the banner of the great Nur ad-Din Zengi that Saladin first stepped onto the stage of history. He was sent to Egypt as part of a military expedition led by his uncle Shirkuh. It was here, amidst the political chaos of the failing Fatimid Caliphate, that Saladin's hidden talents began to shine. He was initially a reluctant commander, preferring the quiet of his tent and his studies to the clamor of the battlefield. But when duty called, he answered. He proved to be a gifted strategist and an inspiring leader. His men saw in him a commander who was different. He prayed with them, shared their rations, and tended to their wounds. His piety was not for show. It was the core of his being. His soldiers would say, "He prays more than the imams, yet fights fiercer than any man." He commanded not through fear, but through a shared faith and a deep personal loyalty. In 1169, after a series of complex campaigns and political maneuvers, his uncle Shirkuh became the vizier of Egypt, only to die 2 months later. In a surprising move, the Fatimid Caliph appointed the young, unassuming Saladin as his successor. Many in the court underestimated him, seeing him as a pliable figurehead they could easily control. They were wrong. Saladin moved swiftly and decisively. He consolidated his power, reformed the Egyptian administration, and strengthened its military. He was patient but firm. Then, in 1171, a pivotal moment arrived. Saladin, acting in the name of the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad, formally abolished the Shia Fatimid Caliphate. For the first time in over 2 centuries, Egypt and Syria were united under the same Sunni banner. This was more than just a political coup. It was a monumental step towards unifying the Muslim world. When his mentor Nur ad-Din died in 1174, the path was clear. Saladin, now the Sultan of Egypt, was the most powerful figure in the region. He was no longer just a general serving a master. He was the master. The Ayyubid dynasty was born, and its founder had a singular, burning vision: the liberation of Jerusalem. But Saladin was a unifier, not a tyrant. He spent the next decade not just fighting, but building. He marched on Damascus, Aleppo, and Mosul, not always as a conqueror, but often as a liberator. Welcomed by populations tired of petty, warring emirs. He used diplomacy as often as he used his army. He forged alliances, married into powerful families, and presented himself as the true champion of Sunni Islam. The defender of the faith against both internal division and the external threat of the Crusaders. His reputation grew with every passing year. Stories of his character spread throughout the land. When Crusader envoys came to his court, he treated them with impeccable honor, engaging in debate and showing respect. When he captured Frankish knights, he often showed clemency, ransoming them or, in some cases, releasing them. He fed prisoners from his own table. This was a calculated strategy, but it was also a genuine reflection of his character. His enemies in the Crusader states, like the chronicler William of Tyre, couldn't help but acknowledge his qualities, describing him as a wise, valiant, and generous prince. Even as they prepared to fight him, they respected him. In the West, he began to be known as the noble infidel. In the East, they called him Al-Malik an-Nasr, the victorious king. By 1186, Saladin had achieved what no Muslim leader had managed in a century. He had forged an empire that stretched from the Nile to the Euphrates. The Crescent was rising, united and strong. His army was not a collection of mercenaries, but a disciplined, loyal force, bound together by a shared purpose and an unwavering faith in their leader. Scholars issued fatwas in his support, poets sang his praises, and warriors from across the Muslim world flocked to his green standard, swearing oaths to God to follow him into battle. The Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem, meanwhile, was teetering on the brink of its own internal crisis. King Baldwin IV, the brave leper king, was dead. The kingdom was now in the hands of the arrogant and reckless Guy of Lusignan, pushed into power by the aggressive, fanatical faction of the court, led by men like Reynold of Chatillon. For nearly a century, the cross had held dominion over the Holy Land. Now, its defenders were divided, arrogant, and about to make a fatal mistake. The final piece fell into place when Reynold of Chatillon, in a flagrant violation of a truce, attacked a rich Muslim caravan, imprisoning its people and seizing its goods. Legend says he even insulted the Prophet Muhammad himself. When Saladin's envoys demanded restitution, Reynold refused. For Saladin, this was the final provocation. The truce was broken. The time for diplomacy was over. He swore an oath to kill Reynaud with his own hands. The call for jihad was proclaimed. From all corners of his empire, Saladin's forces gathered. The greatest Muslim army seen in a generation was on the march. Their destination, Tiberias. Their goal, to lure the entire Crusader army into a trap. In the scorching summer of 1187, the massive Frankish army, the full might of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, marched out to meet him. They were marching away from water into a barren, sun-blasted landscape, towards a destiny that had been forged in the fires of Saladin's ambition and faith. The fate of Jerusalem and the entire Holy Land would be decided on the arid plains near a two-peaked hill known as the Horns of Hattin. The Lion of Islam has risen. The Crusaders march toward their reckoning. The stage is set for one of the most decisive battles in history. Thank you for joining us on the Hour of War. If you're enjoying this series, please make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell so you don't miss what happens next. Because in our next episode comes the Battle of Hattin. In the scorching summer of 1187, the plains of Galilee baked under a sun that felt like heaven's own fury. The dry wind carried a grim perfume of smoke and sweat. On that vast, shimmering horizon, two armies stood poised, one marked by the cross, the other by the crescent. And between them, the destiny of a continent hung in the balance. This was the day Saladin, the Sultan of Egypt and Syria, had meticulously planned for. For years, he had been a force of nature, uniting the fractured Muslim lands, forging powerful alliances and reigniting the fire of jihad in the hearts of warriors who had nearly forgotten its flame. Now, standing upon the hills near the Horns of Hattin, His gaze was a mixture of calm and ferocity. Before him, the Crusader host was a glittering mirage in the blinding sun. They were a magnificent sight, but he knew the truth. They were exhausted, parched with thirst, and marching straight into a trap laid by their own pride. King Guy of Jerusalem, a man more arrogant than wise, had led his knights deep into the desert. Lured away from the life-giving waters of Galilee, away from any semblance of hope. The blistering heat turned their armor into ovens, and a desperate thirst clawed at their throats like a feral beast. Saladin's strategy was nothing short of genius. It was a masterpiece of military art. The precious wells of Hattin were sealed tight. Every escape route was blocked. And his light cavalry, swift and deadly, circled the doomed Christian army like hawks watching their prey slowly succumb. As dawn broke on that fateful day, the air trembled with the thunder of drums. A moment later, a storm of arrows, black as a starless night, rained down upon the Crusader ranks. The knights, weakened and desperate for a single drop of water, tried to muster a rally. The red crosses on their white tunics flashed defiantly in the morning sun, a last gasp of defiance, but it was futile. The heat burned their throats, the swirling desert sand blinded their eyes, and the acrid smoke from the burning grass set by Saladin's men choked their final, desperate cries. By midday, the once proud army of Jerusalem, the most formidable fighting force in the Latin East, was no longer an army. It was a shattered, terrified mob. Above the chaos and the carnage, Saladin's banner, the black flag of the Abbasids bearing the sacred Shahada, rose high over the battlefield. La ilaha illallah, the victorious soldiers roared, their voices a single triumphant wave as they closed in for the final push. There is no God but God. In the chaos, the most sacred relic of Christendom, the true cross, a fragment believed to be from the crucifix of Jesus himself, fell from a bishop's dying hands and was captured. It was a devastating blow to Christian morale. King Guy and the highest-ranking nobles of his kingdom were captured, their pride broken. The rest of the Crusader army either perished under the merciless steel of Saladin's warriors or lay bound beneath the vast, indifferent sky, their crusade over. The Battle of Hattin was more than just a military victory. For the Muslims, it was perceived as divine judgment. The Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem, once so arrogant, so powerful and rich, had been shattered in a single, brutal day. The foundation upon which their 88-year rule was built had crumbled into dust. From the ashes and blood of Hattin, Saladin did not rest. He marched. His army, infused with righteous purpose, moved steadily, unstoppably, toward the greatest prize of all, the holy city of Jerusalem. The city had been taken by the first Crusaders almost a century earlier in a storm of blood and fire, a massacre that had left a deep and lasting scar on the Muslim world. For 88 long years, Muslims had prayed facing Jerusalem, mourned its loss, and dreamed of the day it would be returned to their hands. Now, that dream, once so distant, was standing at their very gates. As Saladin's massive army encamped around the city's ancient walls, a wave of terror washed over its inhabitants. The defenders, mostly weary and demoralized survivors from the disaster at Hattin, manned the ramparts, but in their hearts they knew their fate was sealed. The city was isolated, without hope of reinforcement. For days, the siege unfolded. Saladin's mighty siege engines hurled massive stones against the walls, their impacts echoing through the holy streets. The skies above Jerusalem became a battleground of faiths, the clash of cross and crescent resonating across walls drenched in millennia of history. The defenders fought back bravely, but they were simply buying time. Then, on the 2nd of October, 1187, the city's gates creaked open. Jerusalem had surrendered. Saladin entered the holy city, but he did not enter as a vengeful destroyer. Eager to repay the bloodshed of 1099, he entered as a conqueror of profound mercy. There was no massacre, there was no fire. There was only order, discipline, and reverence. He declared that the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the holiest site in Christianity, would be spared and protected. The magnificent Dome of the Rock, which had been converted into a church, was lovingly cleansed and restored to its original purpose as a mosque. And for the first time in nearly a century, the adhan, the Islamic call to prayer, rose again from the minarets of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, its beautiful, haunting melody drifting over a city at peace. Where the Crusaders had once waded through blood, Saladin offered forgiveness. He established a system to ransom the city's Christian inhabitants, setting a low price that even the poor could afford and personally paying for the freedom of thousands. He allowed Christian pilgrims safe passage to their holy sites, establishing a new order based not on conquest, but on coexistence. Even his most bitter enemies, like the chroniclers back in Europe, wrote his name with a grudging awe. Here was a conqueror who carried not only a formidable sword, but a powerful code of honor. The world had fundamentally changed on that day. From the deserts of Arabia to the great halls of Europe, the news spread like wildfire. Jerusalem had fallen. And in the hearts of both Christians and Muslims, two powerful emotions were reborn. For one, fear and a burning desire for vengeance. For the other, hope and the triumph of faith restored. A new chapter in the great clash of civilizations was about to begin. If you were fascinated by the epic rise and fall of empires and the legendary figures who shaped our world, don't forget to like this video, share it with a friend, and subscribe to our channel for the next chapter in this incredible story. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. The bells of Christendom tolled in grief. From the grand cathedrals of Rome to the stoic towers of London, a single agonizing cry echoed: Jerusalem has fallen. The holy city, the very heart of faith, the jewel of the cross, now lay under the Crescent of Islam. Across the West, priests wept in their pulpits, kings raged in their courts, and common people trembled with a mixture of fear and fury. Pope Gregory VIII, his voice trembling with righteous anger, called for vengeance. Let the sons of God rise again, he declared, and his words set Europe ablaze. And so began the Third Crusade, the mightiest of them all. Three great crowns answered the call. First, Frederick Barbarossa, the Iron Emperor of Germany, a living legend whose red beard was as feared as his sword. Then came Philip II of France, a king as cold and cunning as a serpent. And finally, Richard I of England, the Lionheart, the warrior king whose name was already a myth. Across the continent, forges roared to life, hammering out swords and armor. Banners emblazoned with the cross rose against the sky, and hundreds of thousands of men began the long march east. They swore a solemn oath to reclaim Jerusalem or die beneath its ancient walls. But fate, as always, is a cruel and unpredictable general. The great Emperor Barbarossa, encased in his heavy armor, drowned while crossing an icy river in Anatolia. His age had finally caught up with him. His vast army, now leaderless and broken-spirited, turned back, their crusade ending before it truly began. The two remaining kings, Philip and Richard, were oil and water. Their constant quarreling over strategy and status finally boiled over. Disgusted, Philip of France packed his ambitions and sailed for home. And so, on the shores of the Holy Land, only one king remained. Richard the Lionheart stood alone, the last line of Christendom, facing the formidable crescent moon. In the heart of the Holy Land, two titans prepared for a war that would define their age. On one side, Richard the Lionheart bold, unbending, a king who seemed forged in the very fires of battle. On the other, Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known to the West as Saladin, the Sultan of Islam. A unifier of nations, a man known as both the sword of his faith and a beacon of mercy. The entire world held its breath, watching as the two greatest warriors of their time met not just on the battlefield, but in the currents of destiny itself. The first great clash was at the Siege of Acre. The city's formidable walls shook day and night under the relentless assault of Christian trebuchets, which hurled massive stones and pots of fire. From the ramparts, Muslim archers answered with a thunderous rain of arrows. For months, the blood of two worlds soaked into the same scorched earth. When the city finally fell, Richard, in a move that shocked both sides, ordered the execution of thousands of Muslim prisoners. Saladin was furious at this brutality, yet he held his legendary temper. He knew that rage was a blade he seldom needed to draw. Then came the Battle of Arsafa confrontation that would echo through the centuries. The desert winds howled like vengeful spirits, and the sun burned down with the intensity of judgment itself as tens of thousands of soldiers clashed on the arid plains. But Saladin was a master of desert warfare. He regrouped his forces, and his mounted archers rained death from the surrounding dunes, harassing the Crusader column. Dust rose, choking the air. The clang of blades on shields became a deafening rhythm, and the battle cries of two faiths, Allahu Akbar and Deus Vult, blended into a single, desperate roar, the sound of humanity at war with itself. When the dust finally settled, neither side had truly broken the other. They had tested one another's strength, courage, and resolved in doing so. They had found their equals. In the months that followed, Richard and Saladin waged a war that transcended mere swords and sieges. It became a war of spirit, of character. They fought fiercely by day, but by night, a strange and profound respect blossomed between them. When Richard fell gravely ill with a fever, Saladin, his sworn enemy, sent him fresh fruit and precious snow hauled down from the distant Mount Lebanon to cool his brow. When Muslim soldiers were captured, Richard, learning from his earlier brutality, ensured they were treated fairly. An act of chivalry that Saladin noted. They were enemies. Yes, locked in a holy war, but they were bound by a mutual respect that their followers could scarcely comprehend. Both men seemed to understand what their armies did not, that Jerusalem was more than just a city of stone and mortar. It was a promise, an ideal, and perhaps, just perhaps, promises could be shared without being exclusively owned. At last, in the year 1192, after years of bloodshed had stained the sands red, the two warriors met to forge peace. Under the vast tented sky of the desert, Saladin in his calm and regal dignity, and Richard, weary from battle, but with his spirit unbroken, came to an agreement. They signed a treaty. Jerusalem would remain under Muslim rule, but Christian pilgrims would be granted free and safe passage to visit their holy sites. The war was over. It ended not with a glorious triumph for one side and a crushing defeat for the other, but with a quiet, hard-won understanding. As Richard mounted his horse to begin the long journey home, he turned and looked one last time toward the distant silhouette of Jerusalem. He had not conquered the city, but in a way, he had conquered something far more difficult: his own pride. Just 1 year later, in his beloved city of Damascus, Saladin fell ill. The mighty Sultan, who had humbled the kings of Europe and united the warring factions of the Muslim world, now lay weak in his chamber, his strength failing him. When he died, the man who had ruled an empire stretching across half the known world left behind almost no personal wealth, only a single gold dinar and the simple cloth for his own shroud. As his funeral procession moved through the weeping streets, one of his soldiers held up the shroud for all to see, crying out, "The world's conqueror owns nothing now but this cloth." Saladin was buried beneath whispering trees, where the gentle call to prayer mingled with the wind. And across the world, even his enemies mourned him. Richard, far away in a cold English castle, heard the news of Saladin's death and said softly, "A prince without equal in the world." Centuries have passed, but the dust of the Crusades still lingers in our collective memory. It was never a simple tale of saints versus savages, of good versus evil. It was a mirror reflecting the complex, contradictory nature of mankind itself. Faith clashed with faith, and sword clashed with sword. Yet in the heat of that terrible conflict, moments of compassion, honor, and respect shone through. In the end, it was that respect which outlived all the conquests. Beneath the eternal sun of the Holy Land, the symbols of the cross and the crescent still rise together over Jerusalem, not as emblems of eternal enemies, but as reminders of the same universal human yearning for the divine. And thus ends the greatest of all sagas, the Crusades, the holy wars between cross and crescent. Thank you for watching this series of the Hour of War. If this journey through faith, fire, and the complexities of the human heart has touched your soul, please remember to like, share, and subscribe, because history's echoes, as we've seen, never truly fade.